Okay, everyone, good morning. My name is Chris Brown. I'm the Director of Policy and Research with the Common Sense Policy Roundtable. Thank you so much for joining us this morning and listening to some of our initial observations as it relates to the economic impacts of the current crisis we're facing. Apologies for maybe some of the confusion here this morning. I think we had sent out an invite for 9:15, but maybe the calendar popped up at 9. So we're going to go ahead and get started here. And hopefully my video will turn on, and we look forward to taking your questions and having this discussion. So many of you may be very familiar with the economic and policy work that we do on a range of issues focused on exclusively here in Colorado, with really understanding being as detailed as we can and understanding the economic and fiscal impacts as it relates to Colorado public policy issues. I think what is, we are currently facing unprecedented times. Excuse me, one second. Okay, are we back online? Can we hear the audio now? Are you guys able to hear, I hope? Okay, my apologies, I'm not sure what happened there on the audio. So as I was saying, we traditionally conduct very detailed economic work on a range of public policy issues. And as we are in the midst of this crisis, really what we are interested in doing with today's webinar, and as we'll discuss some of the other resources that we're putting out, is engaging with you during this incredibly unprecedented time so that we can gain some insights in real time. The economic impacts, as I'll describe and talk through today, are undoubtedly severe. And but I think what we want to do is ensure that we are not just looking at this from the perspective of what are the economic impacts, where ultimately does this likely bottom out, and when can we have confidence in our long-term projections, but again, want to provide, I don't think that tells the full story of ultimately what we're seeing from a free enterprise standpoint as it relates to the innovation and ultimately what it will take to get this economy restarted as soon as a lot of the public health crisis is close to or nearly behind us. And I think I'd like to, recognize in this moment a lot of the leadership from our board of directors who ultimately are really the heart of our organization and demonstrate a lot of that spirit and innovation and entrepreneurial spirit that really guides us in many instances. And I'd like to recognize our board chair, Earl Wright, who has decades of experience in the financial industry, was actually played a key role in streamlining the Paycheck Protection Act application to accommodate and support small businesses as they apply for what appears to be a very critical lifeline to preserving payroll and preserving some basic expenses. Along with Heidi Ganal, one of Colorado's most recognized entrepreneurs, who's working very closely with the national group, the Job Creators Network, and serving as a local voice for innovative ideas to get Colorado moving during this time, and again, ultimately, when this rebounds. We would also like to recognize Governor Polis and sort of applaud his foresight in creating the innovation response team, the private sector task force, that we think will ultimately be very critical in developing ideas and communicating ideas to Coloradans that can ultimately make a difference as we cope with this crisis. And in that, serving on that task force, recognizing another board member, Dave Davia, who has played a really instrumental role currently in collecting medical supplies, particularly the PPEs or the protective gear for healthcare workers across the state. So we launched this resource hub that we'd like to continue to provide updates. You can see we have currently posted our podcast, our most recent study. There are additional blog posts and resources that, again, we want to continually update so that we can provide not only economic research, but also be, again, a resource. So let's turn to the economic data and what we currently know about the crisis and about the economic outlook going forward. And ultimately, what we really care about is what this means for Colorado. And this is the picture of the monthly change in US employment prior to our current crisis, looking again on a monthly basis. And we can see a significant downturn through the 2009 financial crisis, but ultimately a very strong rebound through just last month. What we now know is at a national level, there was over 3.3 million new claims for unemployment just following the week of March 14th. So where this will hit the full month of employment is unclear at this point, given the data for the month is not being fully reported. But if we actually look at the history of claims, now this is again weekly the new weekly unemployment claims dating back through the 1970s. It almost doesn't even look like it belongs on the same chart, but you can see where the week of March 16th spike falls in the history of these unemployment claims. And again, we expect last week and this week and the coming weeks to be maybe not quite as severe, but undoubtedly severe and virtually unprecedented. And these is again the number of new cases. Looking at the data a little bit differently and transitioning here specifically to Colorado, This would be the total number of individuals receiving unemployment insurance payment by month in Colorado. So if we look back during the 2009 financial crisis, the number of individuals receiving unemployment insurance payments peaked at about 148,000 individuals. And in our history, the number of new claims had not increased more than 8,000 new claims. What we know from the week of March 14th, and is those claims spiked over 25,000. And again, last week was just as significant. And so we expect these numbers to continue to climb. When we look at this from a quarterly GDP growth rate, and we look back through the history, again, this is going back through 1930 at the annual growth rates of US GDP growth rates, we can see the most severe reductions in annual growth occurring prior to 1950. The financial crisis of 2009 ticked up an annual decline in GDP less than 5%. On a quarterly basis, we can see that we've had in more recent history a few more severe quarterly downturns in GDP, particularly again through 2000, at the end of 2008, early 2009. If we look at the quarterly GDP on the scale, if we incorporate some of the more recent economic projections that we expect, I've included here the outlook, the projections from Goldman Sachs, given they were one of the more recent forecasts to be updated and to come out. We can see that even in the last 11 days, so their forecast from March 20th for this Q2 of 2020, so that's the quarter starting as of yesterday through the end of June, we're expecting a quarterly decline of over roughly 24%. Just 11 days later, they revised that projection down an additional 10% to over 34% for Q2. What is interesting to note is they expect, and many others have expect, a very quick and sharp rebound in quarterly GDP for Q3 2020. So that would be quarter starting again July 1st. Their projection is around a 19% rebound in quarterly GDP. A lot of this, again, we show not to give you what the definitive projection is. There are many other organizations that are actively revising those forecasts, but to, again, just articulate the level of uncertainty and the extent to which these projections in the very near term are very rapidly whipping around and showing that in many ways, again, this crisis is unprecedented and very different from what we've seen in years past. So if we turn to Colorado, the state projections for both the economic outlook and the state revenue collection my apologies. If we look at the recent projections from the state, and they had it was simply it seemed by pure coincidence that a lot of the worst in the economic data or projections, and a lot of the creation and issuing of social distancing guidelines, those came out at about the same time the state, both the Governor's Office of State Planning and Budget and the Colorado Legislative Council, were producing their quarterly forecasts. Now, in those forecasts released a little over 2 weeks ago, they projected a decline in US GDP growth rate of 0.6% roughly. However, the annualized growth rate was still projected to be over 1% for the calendar year of 2020. Those Goldman Sachs projections I showed in the previous slide are projecting an over 6% reduction in annual GDP growth. So the most recent forecasts, again, we have for the state revenue and budget outlook include, I'll say this again, an annual growth rate in GDP of over 1%, and forecasts are now coming out suggesting we may face a calendar year net reductions in growth of negative 6% in annual GDP. Even with these projections, the estimates for the impact on gross general fund were between $300 and $400 million in the current fiscal year that it ends in 3 months. So while we're at the tail end of the budget cycle and a lot of funds have been spent, still projected a significant reduction in expected revenue. And this was, again, even prior to knowing that some of the collection deadlines and income tax filing deadlines would be delayed, which seem like they will certainly have an impact on not only the revenue that's collected from from the lack of economic activity, but if Coloradans are no longer are delaying filings, that will also impact the revenue collection side significantly. So we expect these numbers to be revised quite significantly. For fiscal year 2021, the impact on the gross general fund ranged from about $400 million to $750 million, reduction in new revenue. Now, for a little bit of perspective on the Colorado Legislative Council staff's projection of a reduction in $750 million, to give you a sense of the magnitude, in the last full budget cycle, FY19, the general fund transferred roughly $500 million from the general fund to transportation, and the creation of the state funding of full day kindergarten has a projected cost of around $250 million. So those two expenditures combined, the state transfer from the general fund to transportation and the costs related to the state funding of full day kindergarten, total $750 million. And so where ultimately this will fall is on, however, these impacts are quite large. Now, this is not to criticize the existing forecasts and to criticize the state in their current outlook. They recognized that they were putting out these forecasts at the start of this crisis and recognized what is sort of termed the left tail risk. And so you can see with the uncertainty, the probability of outcome related to their March forecast, they were at that time even projecting an increased probability of much greater reductions in their outlook than they were just 3 months earlier. Clearly, they expected this, and we, again, now that we know the legislature will have the ability to session, expect this revision to be significant and likely before the next June timeframe. So I just want to turn to the modeling work that we've done and give you a sense of the economic scenarios that we can produce and that we are going to continue to work through during this crisis as data becomes available. But it has become clear that some of the most severely impacted industries, now again, this is not exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination. Every sector is being impacted by this. But if we look at just 4 of the sectors most severely impacted, including retail, arts, entertainment, and recreation, so that includes ski mountains and a lot of outdoor activities. We look at accommodation in the hotels. We look at food services and drinking places, so restaurants and bars. For the Denver Metro, this covers about 506, those 4 industries cover about 506,000 total jobs, or roughly 29% of those regions' total economies. For the communities and areas outside of the metro, it's roughly 336,000 total jobs. Retail makes up a slightly higher percent, but overall, it's a slightly low percent. Those 4 industries are a slightly lower percent overall economy. So we developed 2 scenarios to model to model a 50% reduction in those 4 sectors for a full quarter at 90 days, or half of a quarter for 45 days. And so what we do is look across the economy, and by running these scenarios in our dynamic model, we can estimate the macroeconomic impacts as we see very severe disruptions in select sectors, and try to understand how those cascade across the broader economy. So for our scenario 1, we projected a net impact of over 183,000 jobs for the full year. Now, as you may note, in those 4 industries just show there's over 800,000 total jobs, roughly 800,000 total jobs across the state. So a 50% reduction would be well over 400,000. And in the near term, we may likely see that severe of declines in the employment levels. However, when we consider the potential for the rebound in several months, the annual average total net reduction in total jobs would be just over 183,000. Now, while we are still working through these scenarios, looking to incorporate the macroeconomic shocks along with direct impacts to many other sectors, the sectors that we hit directly saw an impact of over 115,000 jobs, which represented only 63% of the total impact. So what we can understand from this is that for every 2 jobs lost across 4 industries, we see another job loss through that reduction in economic activity and economic growth. What we are, as much as, and we are in understanding the employment impacts, but I think because of the nature of employment, looking across the calendar year, we do expect very sharp reductions in the near term, followed by the potential for rehiring and an uptick in the later months of this year. However, what is ultimately lost during these time frames and during these severe reductions is our wages, income, consumption that is ultimately driving state and local tax revenue. So we may see a rebound in jobs, and that will undoubtedly impact the annual averages for the total employment numbers. However, we do expect that in the near term, when you have these severe contractions in wages and consumption, you may see a rebound to some extent in purchasing in out months, but don't really expect that and to offset the losses we're seeing in the near term. And so these directly translate to reductions in state and local tax revenue that will be quite. So I want to just quickly show you a few more results here as I open up the software, and want to give you again a little bit of a sneak peek into the thing and take a look at what the tool can actually help us better understand as we continue this research and really solicit your input and your ideas and your insight, as I'll get into. In this scenario, this is scenario one, again, the reduction in those 4 sectors for the full quarter. The impact, we can see very severe impacts across retail, accommodation, food service, arts and entertainment. However, there is a larger impact on construction jobs than accommodation from a total number standpoint. So construction would be projected to lose slightly more than 14,000 jobs, even though in this model and in this simulation, they were not directly impacted. So again, as you see a drawdown in consumption, new investment, through the pulling back in retail and food services, events, recreation, we see significant impacts across many other sectors, including construction, state and local government, even healthcare, transportation, manufacturing. And so again, this is across the entire state of Colorado. And we can look at this from a jobs perspective, but in our follow-up modeling, we will also be trying to detail not just the employment impacts, but really what the value added, the sales impacts would be across all sectors. Let me transition back here to the model. I do want to get through just these final slides and maybe open it up for some questions or respond to some questions that you may have. So this, if we kind of go back to our economic thinking and looking at this circular flow, we are at a point where households on the demand side and firms on the supply side are experiencing massive and very severe restrictions and constrictions in sales and output. And so we're seeing a reduction in tax revenue, in income, in consumption. At the same time, we are now seeing, or will be seeing in the coming months, a significant increase in outflow of expenditures from the federal government and state and local and state governments to a large extent as well. So we're seeing a simultaneous contraction in money flowing into government. At the same time, we are now seeing this massive outflow. The CARES Act was passed last week, and again, expect dollars to begin flowing. I mentioned the Paychecks program for small businesses, which I believe the application for that will become available either tomorrow or the following day. But the total impact of the CARES Act is to inject over $2.3 trillion, or just below 10% of annual GDP, into the US economy. So it represents a combination of direct payments to households in the form of stimulus checks, an increase in unemployment benefit compensation funding, increased funding to states, loan tax rates for both large and small businesses, increases in grants, and as well as some additional. And you can see the recipients on the other side of the equation in terms of where those dollars will ultimately flow. You know, just for perspective, roughly 10% of Colorado GDP is around 35 to 40 billion dollars. So if Colorado received a proportional share of the CARES Act in terms of money flowing in, it would represent a section of around 35 to just over 40 billion dollars in new spending coming to households and state and local government. Estimates that I've seen suggest the state and local government directly would receive over $2.2 billion. That would be 1.2 billion going to state government and 1 billion going to the state, flowing through to local throughout the state of Colorado. So we're here. Our research from this point on, as we can foresee it, is trying to really understand, both in the release of new data as we expect to come out in the coming weeks, along with a survey that I'll talk through here in a minute, want to understand how much economic activity is occurring, can occur under varying degrees of social distancing, public health measures. So we know we have estimates that are again changing as it relates to the epidemiological modeling, as far as how long we may face some of these social distancing measures. But from our standpoint, we are interested in understanding how much of the economy is operating during these times. We know what the list of designated essential businesses are. We know that non-essential businesses are continuing to operate, but we'd like to solicit your input and encourage you to go to our website, visit commonsensepolicyroundtable.org/COVID-19. You can find our current survey that we are trying to, again, push to industry leaders, individuals like yourself who have some insight into how your business and to how your industry is being impacted, so that we can understand on a more detailed level what these impacts may be under different degrees of, again, social distancing measures. So I want to, again, just wrap this up with saying thank you. Please stay tuned and stay up to date on the research that we're doing. We'll continue to push out information as it becomes available. We remain, again, very optimistic and hopeful that the innovation of Coloradans and the enterprise system will innovate and will adapt and ultimately will recover. And during this crisis, we are, again, very interested in your input and your insights. And I'd be more than happy to take questions at this time, or feel free to follow up with an email. Send us an email. I'm Chris at CSPRco.org. And again, thank you very much for your time and joining us. And I look forward to any questions if there are any. I think we had a question as it relates to the implications for Northern Colorado specifically. I think, again, at this point, we do expect a lot, at this point, we do expect a lot of the impacts to be fairly proportional across different regions, but undoubtedly different communities will face these impacts in very different manners. So we don't have any modeling just yet, or at this point on Northern Colorado explicitly, but if you have any insights or specific knowledge of things that are changing there, please feel free to send us an email and look forward to your input. We have a question that came in related to, at this time, how do we push for deregulation. And I think, I think it's a obviously critical at this time to remove as many barriers as there are to innovation, to new entry into the market, to allow for ways in which businesses can innovate. So I know that through various executive orders that the Colorado governor has looked at reducing some of those barriers, at least on a temporary basis, but undoubtedly long term, we expect, it would be interesting to see if any of those remain. And maybe a question we could follow up with you on there. Yeah, so another question is, to what extent or how will, at the same time we are now facing this severe contraction in the near term because of these, the need for social distancing, we are facing a bottoming out in the dollar of a barrel of oil, and we're seeing major reductions in what the opportunity is for oil and gas industry to continue to produce record levels, and undoubtedly it's simultaneously impacting. We've done a lot of previous research as it relates to setbacks and how that curtails new production, but the reduction in price will obviously have a massive impact on new production. The vital local tax revenue that many communities receive from local property taxes from oil and gas, and so it will be very interesting to see. Maybe again, something we should consider isolating as an impact, along with, because that might be something that persists for a longer term than this near term. It's a great question and something we haven't studied, but might be something worth isolating. So we have a question as it relates to what research exists as it relates to what the recovery rate of consumer spending will be following a deep recession. So at this point, we have not projected out beyond the recovery. As I showed, one of the more recent projections from Goldman Sachs suggests a very sharp rebound in the economy, largely driven by an increase in consumer spending and the ability for businesses to remain open through this crisis and then open doors. But I think that the literature is obviously mixed, and these times are quite unprecedented. So I think it's important for us. We will look back at the history of the rebound post the recession, but and will be a critical element when looking across a full year. But at this point, I think we are still sorting through that. We have a question as it relates to how will this impact the discussion here in Colorado related to Tabor, and is there data that shows how Colorado is in a better position to weather this storm possibly than other states? So I think it's a great question, and I think interestingly, we held our quarterly Eggs in the Economy event, a week before the state released their updated forecast. I believe it was on March 16th, a week before, a few days before some of the worst data as it relates to the potential impact of this was released. And we were fortunate to have the director of the Governor's Budget Office speak at our event and share her insights. At that point in time, her line of questioning and line of discussion was related to how the state could increase reserves and be prepared for the next recession. But I do think that clearly Tabor limits the ability to get out over our skis in terms of new spending. And so I think through the recession demonstrated some ability to allow for a quicker recovery. It remains an outstanding question, I think, not necessarily directly as it relates to Tabor, but more importantly as it relates to how severe these cuts will be in the near term, given the simultaneous downturn and the potential for economic federal stimulus. But I think it's an important part of the Colorado's fiscal discussion, because I think it has proven in years past to prevent some of the overspending that may complicate situations here even more. I think a question is related to the ability of lenders to actually help businesses through the CARES Act, given limited of staffing and training. Yeah, I think there remains some uncertainty in the specifics around eligibility, and organizations are still sorting out to what extent a lot of these provisions and loans and grants may impact their business. However, I think I expect over the coming days and weeks some of that clarity to come about. But I do think that right now there are undoubtedly those challenges. But I don't see any new questions coming in. I really appreciate these questions, because in a lot of ways they give us, as we're holding this webinar, sort of as we are conducting this research and as this crisis is unfolding, it really gives us a lot of different ideas and areas to explore, and gives us a very strong sense of what you all are thinking and looking for in terms of answers. So I greatly appreciate your time this morning. Again, please feel free to send us questions, send us any resources you've come across. Please visit our website, complete the survey if you have just 5 minutes of your time. And we are hosting another one of these webinars where we expect some updated results and some updated modeling in 2 weeks. And we hope that you'll join us then. So thank you so much for your time. And I will conclude the webinar. Thank you so much.